All right, welcome. So excited to be here today for our Strategies to Mitigate Unconscious Bias webinar. I'm Jason Medley, Chief People Officer with Codility, and we have two amazing superstar leaders with us today, and we will chat more about them in a moment. But first, I just want to cover a few things with you and sort of housewarming things with you so that we're sort of all aligned. First, you've actually caught us in a series of webinars that we've been doing over the past month or so around sort of diversity and inclusion in general. This is all leading up to a summit that Codility is actually hosting on March 23rd. We have amazing, it's a half day of events. We have some amazing speakers that I'm looking very forward to learning from myself. And we will actually share a link to that summit here today. So you should see that. We will also follow up with you in email on some of the learnings that we take away from today, including a recording of this session. And we'll also have the link to that summit there as well. So we're very, very excited about that. Before we get started, just to let all of you know, we want this to be sort of interactive as much as possible. You do have a chat feature at any time. If you have questions, drop those in there. We have someone sort of moderating the questions, and we've built out enough time towards the end, the last 15-20 minutes or so, we're going to be able to sort of answer some of those questions. So at any time, feel free to answer questions. Also, the topic that we're talking about when we talk about mitigating unconscious bias is one of those things that's a really meaty topic, and there is no company out there who has mastered this, who is perfect at this. For some people, this is a very scary and uncomfortable topic at times, and we recognize that. And so if there's anything you can add to the conversation, or if you would like to do that, or something you've tried or have done, please feel free to do that here. We're all here to sort of learn together. We're all very much on this journey. Some of us are in different parts of this journey, but we're all on this journey to sort of do right by this. And so just want to encourage you to be able to use that chat feature. Well, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel for today. I'm actually going to let them introduce themselves because they're going to be able to do it better than I can. But Madira is a superstar employer brander from Amazon, based out of the UK, if I got that right, out of London, I think. Everyone's sort of moving around now, so every time I say where somebody's at, I always get it wrong. They always tell me they're in Spain or some beautiful island somewhere. And then Rocki is the Chief Diversity Officer over at SmartRecruiters. And so we're so thankful to have both of you with us today. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And Madira, maybe we'll start with you. So maybe you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then maybe just in general, would love to understand why you were so excited to join us today and why this topic, especially for you, is so important, and what role that you play around this topic of unconscious bias at Amazon. And then Rocki, would love for you to do the same thing.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks for letting me join this panel. I'm really enthusiastic about it. As you said, I'm looking after employer branding in EMEA with the focus on the consumer org of Amazon. So basically everything behind Amazon.com. And I love employer branding because I just love creating experiences that make people happy. And within my role in Amazon, I try to strive to build a brand excellence strategy, because I believe that employer branding is a business asset. So I'm really, really into employer branding, and in my role, we're always dealing with unconscious bias, because not only the evidence that is out there that is overwhelmingly showing that unconscious bias seeps into the decisions that affect the recruitment process, but it's also touching on employer branding because we are influencing the top of the funnel, right? Because we are attracting the candidates. So within the communication strategy and the marketing efforts that we're doing, there's always an unconscious bias element involved. So I'm really enthusiastic to talk about this. But as you said, also still learning and trying to find out what works. So I'm pretty excited to be here today.
Oh, welcome. Thank you for that so much. And I love, employer branding very much tied to business strategy, right? It's so related, and there's so much opportunity there. Thank you. Welcome. Rocki.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. And I actually love anytime I get to have a conversation with Mo or Jason. I can always guarantee that it's going to be a great conversation. So thank you for having me here. I am the Chief Diversity Officer at SmartRecruiters. And so, part of my job is to help support our clients to achieve better diversity hiring outcomes. And the other part of my job is to make sure that SmartRecruiters as an organization is an organization where the culture is built on the assumption of diversity and that sits on top of a culture that supports equity, inclusion, and belonging. And one of the reasons why I always enjoy having the conversation about unconscious bias is because unconscious bias sits across all of those dimensions, right? From our recruiting processes and how we attract, when you think about diversity and thinking about that from a perspective of representation and how we show up, how we brand, what our diversity brand equity is, and how bias shows up through that, through the interview process, through how we engage with people, to how we retain people, to how we look at equity, to how we include people. And so I think if we're not aware of unconscious bias, look, we all have them, and that's the first step. It's kind of like being in AA. The first step is to acknowledge and admit we all have them, and it is actually okay. But until we acknowledge them and balance those with privilege and power, we can't actually make progress against what we're trying to accomplish. So I think a conversation about unconscious bias is always important if we're going to actually stop having good intentions and start having impact.
I love that, Rocki, and I think we're all humans, right? Like we all have this bias. I saw an organization release some content about what they were doing around this the other day, and they said part of how we're going to measure ourselves is eliminating unconscious bias altogether. And it's like, that's never going to happen, right? That's never going to happen. And I think this panel, we very much understand that. But to start us out with, and for all of you out there today, the way I'd love to structure this conversation is first really understand what is unconscious bias, how does it show up, who's usually affected by it, and what can we start to do to mitigate it, right? Because I think that's the goal. How can we mitigate this? And then two, once we understand that, what can we do to sort of attract more diversity into our pipelines, and how can we nourish diversity in making sure that we're sort of getting over the unconscious bias in those processes and not overcome it, but mitigate it, right? So Rocki, I think kind of going to you first, first of all, what is unconscious bias, right? What is that? Which groups of people tend to be most affected by unconscious bias? And then in a few minutes, we'll sort of get into how to mitigate it. But I would love just to start the conversation there. What is it, and who's affected by it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to try to understand what unconscious bias is. And it is literally those unconscious thoughts that are deeply rooted in the way we process information, that allow us to make judgments on how we see things. And bias is embedded in, and I'm not kind of a human psychology major, right? But bias is embedded there to actually allow us to assess situations and, as human nature, keep us away from dangerous situations, right? So I have a bias towards fire. I'm supposed to. If I get too close to it, it is going to burn me, right? And so I have a subconscious reaction, right? If you light a match, I might flip back. That's kind of an example of an unconscious bias. It's so deeply rooted because from the time we are first born, we tell kids, don't touch the stove, don't touch the stove, don't touch the stove, don't play with the matches, don't pick up the lighter, don't go touch the candle. And so all of these messages have been put in us from times we can't even explain, and so now it's embedded. So now I have a reaction to fire, right? And it's built there for a reason. It's built there to protect me. Okay. And so then when you start to talk about unconscious bias, that's how bias works. Bias is built in the communities and the values for which we were raised, the conversations that we've heard, conscious and unconscious, and they're there to inform how we react to certain situations. It's okay to have bias. The problem with bias is when we don't recognize it, when we don't understand it, when we don't understand when we're having it and it is a wrong bias to have because it's deeply rooted in something that we've been taught, and when we are in positions of power and privilege, and then we're asserting our bias. And so there's a couple of different ways I would go with this. I think that might help, and we can talk about if we'd like. I think to understand bias and who is most adversely impacted, we need to talk a little bit about the different dimensions of diversity. And then I think we could talk a little bit about the most common biases, and you might start to see how they formulate and how they impact each other.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I'd love to actually go down into the dimensions of diversity, right? And what sort of that looks like. Because I think I think there's some that people automatically think about, but then I think there's a lot of others that we don't think about. And so I would love to hear from you, Rocki, and then from you, Mariara, like what you've seen in your careers and the dimensions of diversity that sort of popped up for both of you.
Yeah. I think when we talk about dimensions of diversity, let's be honest, guys, what we all usually talk about is race, gender, sexual orientation. And here in the US, we talk about vet status because those are common. We're used to talking about those from an EEO perspective. It's where we're trying to recruit from. So like when we think about diversity, those are the things that most commonly come up. But what I'd like to challenge you on is to understand that's not even scratching the surface. So when you think about dimensions of diversity, there's identity dimensions, right? Which are some of the things that we just talked about. And there's internal dimensions. So you're talking about appearance, personality, physical ability, age, ethnicity, sexual orientation. So those things fall into identity dimensions and internal dimensions. But then there's community dimensions of diversity too. Am I a vet? What's my marital status? How was I educated? What are my religious and spiritual beliefs? So those are the things that sit in community dimensions that also impact how we show up. Then there's social life experience dimensions. So was I homeless? What was my social economic status? Did I grow up in a family that shared addiction? What were the historical events that went on? All of those will shape how I show up and how I look. And then there's institutional dimensions, right? Am I a student? Am I an executive? What do I do? Am I blue collar? Am I white collar? Do I get paid hourly? Do I make salary? And so diversity is very complex, and yet and still the lens that we look at it in tends to be very narrow. And so when you think of it this way, like I am so proud of the LGBTQ community for embracing the use and getting us all to embrace the use of pronouns, right? And I'm a big supporter of that. And I am a big supporter of the LGBTQ community. What I realized, because for a long time, I'm not a person who you would say, see, she, her on, anything that you'd look at. And so I questioned myself, like, am I not being supportive? What's my challenge around that? My personal challenge is she, her is only one part of how I show up in the world. So now, like, if you look at things where I do leave that signature, you'll see I identify as she, her, Black, Christian, Gen X, wife, mom. Because who's to say that any one of those dimensions impact how I show up in a more proportionate way? When you look at me, you can quickly see that I'm a Black woman. Okay. But you may not know that I'm a Christian. You may not know that I am 52 years old and part of Gen X. I hope you don't can look at me and see that. Like, you may not know that I'm a wife and a mother of 4. You may not know that I'm a Christian, and that informs how I show up. So I think when we think about dimensions of diversity and then the associated bias, which we'll go into in a minute, we really need to understand that we're talking about multiple dimensions of diversity.
So as you say all that, to some people that can be really overwhelming, right? It's like, whoa.
It is.
And so, Modiara, if you're leading employer branding, holy smokes, where do you start? Like, how do you like can you even get it right? How do you begin to start to tackle this?
It's a great question. And it's a question that I ask myself every day, actually, because of the different dimensions. And I mean, it has two sides, right? I mean, as a marketer by heart, I'm a big fan of hyper-personalization. So, it means that everybody can be touched by the advertising that we send out on these channels, and that are touching on all the different dimensions that Rocki just spoke about. But on the other hand, also don't want to, I'd say, exclude people by overly focusing on one dimension. And then you also have the business strategy, wherein you have D&I goals that you have to work with. And for example, you want to focus on hiring women in tech. Where do you start? Like, do you start with, targeting women on a niche channel, or am I then excluding men, and that's not allowed by law? So it's I think it's a campaign based question. If you ask me, it really starts with, okay, what's the goal that we're trying to achieve, and then how can I make sure that we're not excluding, but we're also including the right factors to attract the right people. But it's definitely challenging.
Modiara, I'm trying not to go too deep with you yet, because I know you have such a wealth of knowledge around this topic, and I want to make sure that we capture the spirit of unconscious bias first. But how do we really start to mitigate unconscious bias, right? So before we even look at like every aspect of our funnel and our recruiting funnels, like how do we sort of think about this on a higher level? And Rocki, I know you and I have talked about this before. You sort of have 4 key ways that you think about this to eliminate bias as much as possible. How do you think about it?
I think if you ask me, if you take a step back and you look at it from a strategical point of view, there are a few things that you can focus on. So one would be education, educating, for example, your hiring managers. It's a really quick thing to do, but it definitely helps, because as Rocki just said, like hiring managers could also make choices that are safe for them. Right? Like it's the unconscious bias that keeps you safe. So I'm going to choose for a candidate with a resume from a really nice big brand tech company because he or she worked there, instead of the candidate from the scale up. Because I don't know the name, but at the same time, that candidate has had so much more experience that is suitable for the role that you're hiring for, right? So really like educate your hiring managers. The other thing that I think is really important is to have a long-term vision. What I see around me is that lots of companies have ongoing D&I projects, they have D&I goals, which is great, but there's a lack of long-term vision and policy. Like, if you really want to do this right, then in my opinion, D&I should be as much as a given as integrity. It's not making it part of your vision and values. It should be in there already, in a way. So long-term vision. Then I think awareness, really by creating connections and introducing, by bringing people together. So, for example, organizing events that connect underrepresented groups with the kind of recruitment team that you have. And another thing that I think is often overlooked, but still very useful, is just use technology to eliminate bias. There's so much technology out there, and it's hard to kind of to pick the right one, but they're really good ones that can help you to eliminate that.
Great, and I'm gonna pull us into that in a few minutes, and so when folks walk away with some examples, for sure, we'll get that before we go. Rocki, how do you sort of think about this? How can we start to sort of mitigate bias?
Yeah. So it's so funny, as we approach this conversation today, I usually have my hat on that's really about that intersection of diversity and recruitment and think about things through that lens. I'm going to take a step back, though, and use the side of my brain, my heart, my experience, and talk about this a little bit from a leadership perspective, right? And an overall elimination of bias perspective. And I think the first thing that we need to do is understand what the common biases are, because we can't change something. Like I always say, I can't fix the it if I don't know what the it is, right? And so bias comes in a lot of forms that could seem, we just don't pay attention to it. Is it affinity bias, where like Mo was alluding to, like I hire someone or I lean towards people who are like me and have a similar background to me. And I will tell you, as a diversity leader and an equity and inclusion and belonging advocate, I'm really concerned about the increase in affinity bias as we move to a remote workforce, because people want to trust people, and the easiest way in absence of not being able to see you is to use that affinity bias. We know what ageism is. What about appearance bias? Guys, like, let's get really real for a few minutes. Like, how many times do we look at someone and say, oh, she's fat, so, she can't do this job, or shit, she's gorgeous, therefore she must be the perfect person for this job. So that appearance bias is so much deeper than I see black or I see white or I see whatever.
They don't have a picture on LinkedIn. What's wrong with it? or what are they doing? What's going on? Right? But by the way, the worst thing ever, putting pictures on LinkedIn, probably. Good, really great.
But Jason, you just called out another one, like attribution bias. So I'm making a judgment or assumption, right? So I'm making a judgment or assumption because you don't have a picture on LinkedIn that something is wrong with you. No, maybe I just don't want you to know what I look like. Maybe I don't show up that way. It's confirmation bias. So, when a woman comes into an interview that's a mom and asks the question about what are the working hours, or do you have flexibility? If I already think that, if I have this bias that women are not going to work as hard because they're distracted by their personal life, then the moment you ask that question, I use it to confirm something that's already out of whack in my own brain. That's confirmation bias. It's conformity. I'm going to wave with my peers. I'm going to be swayed by others, or I'm going to compare and contrast Rocki to Mo because, that's contrast bias, or preferring one gender or the other, or, so there's lots of different types of biases. So I think the first thing we have to do as leaders in our organization and as people who are committed to minimizing bias, not eradicating it, but minimizing it, is to acknowledge them. And then I think this is where we want something really quick that's going to be a checklist of what I can do. But I think, honestly, this is a matter of heart. It's a matter of, we teach this in our inclusive leadership training. Let's walk away from, I'm a good person with good intent, or I'm right. And let's put ourselves in someone else's shoes. So it's really about a bit of humility. It's about acknowledgement. It's about understanding. It's about empathizing, and it's really about moving away from this excuse of, well, I had good intentions, and moving to a place where you go, okay, but this has impacted someone else. And fundamentally, I think a big problem is that when we talk about diversity, when we talk about bias, we talk about we're going to talk about strategies and tools, and we're going to talk about pledges, and we're going to talk about all of these kind of things that, look, guys, we have to do to move the conversation forward and to actually force action. The problem is, and the gap is that we're not talking about people. So when all of a sudden I can connect you and say, this is how this thing that you did, good person, and this bias that you have affected Jason, affected Mo, affected Rocki in a very real way, I think that that can shift the perspective. Jason, you know this, you've heard my podcast. It's the whole purpose of it. Like, let's start to listen to people who are underrepresented and how this bias is affecting them. And I think that's the most important thing we could do.
Yeah, no, I love that. It makes me think, one of the, and we're going to get into some tactics here in a second, but, I was thinking about, and Rocki, you and I talked about this before, it's sort of like, even from when we think about job descriptions and we're trying to attract folks from underrepresented groups, like one of the best things is just put that job description in front of someone who's a member of one of those underrepresented groups and get feedback, and I learned that early in my career. Hey, if I want to attract more women, like, is this, does someone who identifies as a woman, do they look at this and think, hey, I want to join this organization? Do they get excited by it? Is there bias in it, right? And so really helping to sort of understand. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. As we sort of move through the conversation a little bit, and we understand that we all have biases and there's different types of biases. And so we go, okay, great. So now I want to think about how do we start attracting some of these underrepresented groups that we would like to go after? But then two, how do we make sure down funnel that we're protecting ourselves from that bias showing up, right? So one is we're recognizing it. And then I think there's tools and there's processes and structure. I think one thing I'd love to understand, and Modiara, I think that you could probably help with this. So if I'm when we think in general, like what do folks who identify with some of these underrepresented groups, what do they look for? Like, what kind of qualities do they look for in organizations? How should we be thinking about this as employer branders as we're sort of out there? What should we be doing?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I thought about it before the webinar, which made me conclude that I think underrepresented groups are looking for exactly the same as anybody else. If you talk about people, process, and technology, if you really talk about that people element that Rocki was just highlighting, I think that they're looking for acceptance, possibilities to grow, develop, being recognized, and also just finding a mission and vision that they can buy into. So overall equality, right? I mean, one of the trends that you see now within tech companies is that everybody has affinity groups all of a sudden, right? Like, we have it as well. And I think it's great because, these are groups where people can find one another. And that's awesome, especially in the remote world where we are working in right now. But at the end of the day, everybody wants to be treated equally. So when it comes to qualities in an employer, I would say offer that equality. I'm wondering what Rocki thinks about this now, actually.
Yeah, so you know what? It's interesting. Just Capital has a stat out, and I want to say it's something like 78% of all people expect their employers to rally around diversity and create organizations where everybody feels included, right? So it's not even just underrepresented people who want it, Jason. Everybody wants it, right? But when I think about looking at this through a lens of someone who's underrepresented, I want to look at a company from a brand perspective and be able to see myself in it. Can I see myself working there, right? So, if I go to a career website and it's all, white cisgender men, I probably can't see myself in that, right? Like, it doesn't seem like there's room for me. If I am differently abled, can I access the job process, right? Is there even a way for me to be able to see the job description or hear the job description, or what does that look like? So this isn't just about kind of gender or race, it's about all dimensions of diversity, right? When I go through the hiring process, does the process seem fair and equitable to me? when I went through the interview process, did I see anyone that looked like me, felt like me, or I felt like represented a dimension of diversity, right? I think that I also look in terms of the culture of the organization. Is this something that appears to be the buzzword of the moment, or is inclusion, not diversity, but is inclusion embedded in the overall culture of the organization? Look, many of us are just starting this journey. So like, as a person who's underrepresented, I don't expect to like look at your whole organization and see it perfectly balanced and perfectly represented of the demographics of your particular area. What I do expect to see is that this is more than lip service. And that it's a culture built, and it's not just the CEO who's saying we believe in diversity. It's all the managers that I meet. It's the person I'm going to sit next to. That's what I think that someone who's underrepresented looks like. Am I going to be welcomed? Do I belong? Is there not only like, okay, so you've said diversity is important. You've made a seat at the table for me, but am I going to be comfortable at the table sitting there eating and talking to the people on my left and right?
Yeah. I agree with that totally. I think from a branding perspective, that is also what we focus on, just to make sure that everything that we do is represented externally, but also, for example, if you go through the interview process, that there's a diverse interview panel that you can talk to, and yeah, we do these things. But on the other hand, as I said in the beginning, I think that, you know, they want exactly the same as anybody else in a way.
Yeah. And at Rocki, as you were chatting, what was going through my mind was, how do you do this and come across authentic versus checking a box, right? And I think because that's what a lot of people worry about too. They're like, well, we want to be authentic in this. Like, we don't want to feel like we're just doing it to sort of check a box, or a lot of organizations do that just to sort of check. We have to do it. Let's do it. We've got to diversify our interview panel. Is the answer just, if you're authentic, it's naturally going to come out in conversations? Or does it really go back to the fact that, you know, solving this isn't one thing, it's a host of things, and it becomes authentic when we see it in a lot of different places versus just like in one place on your website, or you sort of have, you know, a diverse, you know, stock photo on your website. I don't know, how do you, and especially from a marketing perspective, how do you balance authentic with sort of like coming across authentic, but also doing what you know needs to be done?
If you ask me, I think it's about showing real content. And that's maybe a little bit goes without saying, but you still don't, you don't see that everywhere. It's just use the people that are working within your company to promote the company, and don't do stock photos and things like that. I really create an experience that is inclusive, if you like. And that could start with how you're screening your resumes to that diverse interview panel, but really make sure that you really share and I don't know, deliver an experience that connects to this with this.
I think it's about adopting a posture of being proud and not perfect, right? Because we're all going to be at different stages of this journey. So I think part of authenticity is being honest and saying, you know what, this is where we are today. And not lying not trying to use stock photos and make it look different than it is, and all these kind of things, and being able to say, this is why it's important to our company. We know we're not where we want to be, but this is where we are today. And transparently, here's what we commit to doing. And those things can be sustainable actions that you can take, that you can actually show progress against. I don't think people expect you to be perfect. I think that they expect you to make progress so that you're having impact and not intention, and that you're proud of what you're doing and you're honest about what you're doing.
Authentic. That's how to be authentic. So now that we've talked a little bit about what unconscious bias is and how it sort of shows up, and some things that we can do, especially from an employer branding perspective, What are some other things, Modiara, just in terms of general sourcing, like just out there, sort of some channels or some ways that we can sort of really reach these groups? What are some some tactical things that we can do? You mentioned some technologies earlier. I would love just to kind of get inside your brain a little bit, and of course, Rocki, jump in anywhere. But any ideas or any thoughts that you have for the folks that are out here, and also being mindful. Listen, there's some folks on the call who aren't functional leaders, right? So this may not be a priority in their organization, but they really want it to be, and they're a recruiter, and maybe they're only in control of what they're in control of. Like, what can folks like that do today as they sort of walk away from here?
Yeah, I think when it comes to tools, for example, you don't need to have a big budget to implement D&I initiatives, right? I mean, like, for example, I just spoke about the data masking of resumes, which is a big trend amongst big tech companies, where they mask, for example, universities or age or religion or ethnicity. But if you don't have the tool or the kind of authority to change this as a recruiter, you could also just say, okay, well, I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to mask all the personal details from this candidate and let my hiring manager only look at the working experience, especially in tech. That can be really helpful. And you can do it yourself. Another thing that I think is interesting, but it's kind of going against what we're talking about, but I just want to highlight it anyway, is the trend of video interviewing. I think that lots of companies have integrated this right now, considering the current climate that we are in. But I sometimes wonder that, who says that this doesn't create bias in the first place? Like, if you interview someone, let's say via video for a logistic role, just an example, you might overly focus on how communicative that candidate is. Well, you might wonder, is that even necessary for that specific role? Or the same could go for a tech role, right? So there are also tools out there which you think, okay, I'm going to implement this in my process so I can be diverse and the candidate has a face and stuff like that. But it can also work the other way around.
Actually, so sorry to interrupt. I actually like that example, because what about internet bandwidth and access to internet and strong access? Like, we all don't have
social economical is a dimension of diversity, right?
Yeah, like we all don't have the highest package or can afford the highest package, and it cuts out, to your point, Rocki. And so and if it gets frozen or if it's slow, it's aggravating. It's an aggravating experience as an interviewer, right? And vice versa. And that's a really good point.
Yeah. So
I learned that lesson the hard way last year.
Well,
so were you going to finish?
Yeah. Good.
Oh no, I was just thinking that there was another tool that came to mind, and it was the augmented writing tools that you have out there right now. Like, they can help you filter gender-coded words or age-related terms and other stuff. It's like comparable to Grammarly, only then for job descriptions. And I think that that's super cool. But let's say you don't have the budget for that. You can just browse on the web and kind of figure out how you can write a bias-free job post, by, for example, using local language, or write your ads or your job posts without jargon. These are small things that we often forget, because the hiring manager just says, oh, this is what I want in my job description, and there you go. But really kind of challenge the situation and maybe ask somebody who is already in that role to read the job description and be like, well, is this attractive to you, or is it just not interesting at all to look at?
Yeah. And I think if you have the budget, Textio is really great. There's also some free gender decoders as well. Just Google gender decoder and there's some options out there. Sorry, Rocki, go ahead.
That's okay. I think if we're going to talk about tools, I can't be on here and not talk about our diversity hiring toolkit, right? Because, and Jason knows, it really can help you hone in on what you need to be working on and what steps you can take, right? And so I personally think the first thing you want to do is take an honest assessment of where you are in terms of your capability of hiring diverse talent, right? Guys, don't get on any webinar and expect to get this, like, here's the checklist I need to do, and I must need to do all these things and check. They may not be right for your organization. And, if you're at a stage 1, you don't want to be trying to put in stage 4 initiatives. And that's how we get that imbalance of seeming authentic, right? You want to be able to assess, where am I today? Where do I need to grow? And how do I do that? And so our diversity hiring toolkit has a maturity model that says, where am I in the process today? And I'm going to and it allows you to take an assessment. It's a free tool. And then you're going to get back this rating of where you are in terms of your diversity hiring maturity. And then actually this robust report around, what can I actually do? So if I'm at a stage 1, what's the next step? Not what do I need to do 10 steps down the line, but what's the next step that I can do? I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, and I'll say I've taken this. It's amazing. Just answering the questions yourselves give you tons of ideas immediately, and then what comes out on the back end is really great as well. And there's so much in that that's actually free, right? Like, you walk away and you're like, there's things I can implement today. There's things that I can, it's forward facing as well. It helps you to think about taking baby steps on this journey. And that is a huge place to start. And it's also a great place to start where, because this topic is so scary and it feels so heavy and sometimes it feels impossible, you can see the small steps you can start to take to sort of get to your overall vision or your overall goal. Before we get to questions, one area I want to transition to is the idea of goals and measuring for effectiveness. So, throughout probably, the past 10 years, as we've really started having this sort of conversation around diversity and inclusion, as it's gotten heavier, there's been different conversations about what you should measure, what you should publicly, share, how you do this effectively. And I'd love to have a conversation around this, like where, how do we start with goals? Like what are realistic goals? And what should they be like, and what should they look like, and where do they appear? But then also, how do we measure for effectiveness? How do we know if we're truly making some movements against things like unconscious bias and overall sort of the feeling of diversity and inclusion in an organization? And either one of you can jump in.
If it's all right, I have some ideas. I think when it comes to goals, there's one thing I've learned throughout kind of my working experience is that you need to set goals that are realistic and that are connected with the labor market. You cannot hire more women in tech than that are out there. So if you're setting a goal for yourself, in this simple example, then be realistic about what you want to achieve. Then secondly, when it comes to measuring, this is also one of the challenges that I have, I think, on a daily basis. But what I would say is how to measure D&I is really to work with recruitment and workforce analytics. So analyze your recruitment data, and you see that that's a role that is becoming more and more important within the industry. We recently onboarded a great new colleague of ours. His name is Toby. And he's doing an excellent job with this. So he's kind of analyzing all the recruitment data. But in an ideal world, what I want is that I want to connect my marketing data with my recruitment data, with my workforce data, to really see if the efforts that I'm putting in the beginning, if that has a result in the end. So measure, collect as much data as you can. And here in the EU, we have to deal with GDPR. For example, so things that we're doing right now is implementing self-voluntary identification, where we're asking people if they want to say which gender they identify with, or if they want to share the religion and stuff like that. But it can be challenging and different per country. But if you have the possibility to ask, you can always ask. You cannot make it obligated, but an obligation. But yeah, still. So it's a way to collect more data, I would say.
I certainly agree with everything that Mo said. I would just add a couple of things. I think sometimes we get so embedded in the data that we're down in the weeds and we can't look up. So I think I would just encourage you to find out a balance of that. So if I could think about what's a couple of things that I would measure that tell me if I'm having impact, not good intentions, is at the end of the day, it's the landscape of your organization changing.
Yeah. Observe your work.
Have you increased the amount of diversity within your workforce? That is the primary thing you should be measuring, because if you're not doing that, then it really doesn't matter how good the rest of the stats look. They're about intention. They're not about impact. So start with, this is what I started with. This is where I am. Is there more? Yes, no. I mean, that's one thing. Two, I think it's about, again, it doesn't have to be always this long employee engagement survey data, although again, I do that and I appreciate that and I get lots of data. But do a pop survey and ask your people, how are we doing against diversity? Do you feel like you belong, that you're included? It's really simple. Look at the results here, look at the results here. Are they trending up? Are they trending down? Do the same for the people that you're interviewing. Could you ask all people that come into your process, whether they get hired or not, what is your experience with your brand? Do you feel like we prioritize, the needs of all of our candidates coming through? And then can you look at how people come into, how diverse candidates, where you can get the data? Because to Mo's point, depending on where you are geographically, this could be a challenge. But if you allow people to self-identify, can you look at where diverse people come into your funnel and where they fall out, and identify where you have problems and then focus in on that? I feel like if you didn't measure anything else but those things, you could actually move the needle forward.
Such good insights there. And Rocki, I want to push you a little bit, or I want to push both of you a little bit more. Is there anything we shouldn't do, right? When we're thinking, when we're goal setting or collecting data or sharing data, what should we be cautious of?
Well, nobody wants to be hired because they fit into a category. I didn't want to be hired as the chief diversity officer for SmartRecruiters because I am a Black woman. I wanted to be hired because I am more than excellently qualified for the job. And I think it's important that while you're setting goals, the ultimate goal is about increasing the number of candidates that come in at the top of the funnel and the number of diverse candidates that are coming in at the top. So there's, like, anyone who says there's not good talent, diverse talent out there, you're wrong, right? Your job is to attract them to the top of the funnel. And so that as your funnel narrows, you've got more and more of those people coming out of the bottom because they're equally or better qualified, but you've got to get them attracted, right? So I think it's this whole balance of, I have to set goals for myself, but the goal isn't necessarily, okay, I'm going to choose this person because they are this particularly. This, at the same time, what I would say to you is that you do have to make some decisions, and you do have to lean out, and you do have to make space. So one of the questions I would ask is, how are we thinking about this through the whole process? Does a sales coordinator really need a degree from Harvard? No, and it's exclusive, right? If you have, two exceptionally qualified, equal candidates that both are incredible, or both culture fits and culture adds, you could close your eyes and select one or the other and know that you have got a great person, then honor your commitment.
Yeah, I'm thinking for anyone who's ever been in recruiting, if you've ever recruited yourself, you have story after story of how you knew a certain candidate could do a job. They may have had an underrepresented background. They had a different background. Maybe they didn't come, if you're hiring in a tech company, they weren't this sexy tech background. They didn't come from Google or Facebook, or they didn't graduate from Stanford if you're in the US, right? and but you knew in your heart of hearts that they did everything. How can, again, if I'm a recruiter, if I'm not a leader, like how can I help? Like, how can I help hiring managers buy into this? Like, how can I help them understand and sort of connect the dots? What can I do to sort of start working on their heart and not even their heart, but also just intelligently connect the dots of competencies and help them understand that they can do this job?
Well, it goes back to our theory about organizational support being a key pillar of this process, right? When you think about organizational support, it goes back to what Mo said earlier. Have you trained everyone? And it has to come from executive all the way down. And when we talk about training, it's not just unconscious bias training, inclusive language training, et cetera, but it's also about saying, here's your role in our organization of hiring people. Have we taught people what we expect them to do as hiring managers? And then have we taught them how to be inclusive leaders, which, to your point, Jason, is, I would always argue, not only about head, but it's about heart. And then have we empowered them to make those decisions? And then guess what? Are we holding them accountable? I've never seen a business problem that has been resolved any quicker than when you make it part of someone's performance review and their bonus payout. So are you incenting them to make these decisions that are aligned with your overall strategy?
I love that. I love that. Tie it to money. Tie it to money, and things will change. Sorry, Modiar, were you going to add something there?
There's so much good stuff that it's hard to add anything. But I think that my key takeaway, my key thing to give would be, stop seeing D&I as a trend. It's not going to go anywhere. Like, stop seeing it as a goal, as something that you need to check, like tick a box, and then you can go on to the next one. No, it's going to be here, and it's going to be more. It's going to develop. So really make sure you define that long-term vision. It doesn't matter in which role you are, if you're in a recruitment role or, in HR. Really make sure that you understand this and that you try to contribute from whatever role you have. It's not a trend, it's lasting.
I love that. Those are great final words from you. And Rocki, I want to give you a chance to offer up any final words as well. I will say on the questions, I've been moderating, we've been talking in the background here, and it looks like the two of you actually did a great job actively answering questions as they were coming in. We got to them. So feel good about that.
Cool.
Rocki, I want to give you a chance as well. Any final thoughts or anything that you want to mention that folks that folks should hear before we depart today?
If I could add on Mo did such an eloquent job of kind of closing us out. This isn't a trend. This is a business imperative, but more importantly, it's about people. And we all are in positions of power and privilege where we can impact the lives of people who are underrepresented. And we can do that one conversation, one story, one action at a time.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to leave it. Thank you both so much today. I feel like we could probably talk for hours on this topic. I actually took a bunch of notes myself. Thank you so much. As a reminder, everyone, we will have a recording of this for you. I think we'll deliver it to you by this coming Monday, with some of the tips and tricks as well that we sort of talked about today, some of the insights that we learned. Also, please follow a couple of links. I think we posted Rocki's link in here as well, so you could all sort of you could sort of fill out the diversity survey and sort of get that report. Also, please remember our summit. We would love to have you there. A lot of great folks with a lot of wonderful experience who are trying to tackle these very things. I'll actually be leading a panel on how do you balance, when you're going through hypergrowth, how do you balance growing and sort of meeting the demand of headcount and the business, while also trying to keep things like diversity and inclusion in mind. And a lot of leaders are faced with that because they immediately think that it slows you down, right? If you do this, so how do you do it? How do you balance those things? And we have some amazing panelists who are going to be part of that. So from the likes of Airbnb and Affirm, who have been doing amazing work in through sort of their hypergrowth story. So we will see you soon. Thank you so much again, Moriara and Rocki. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. It's a pleasure just to be part of this conversation. Thank you for allowing me to be part of it. And we will see you next time.
Appreciate you both. Thank you.
Thanks.